Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. My name is John Drummond. And again, as I often say, the TNT Show and Indie Live are growing and delivering more exciting shows. So you can watch this TNT Show on IndieLive.net. It's streamed out to YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus, if you want to check this show later or send it to others or share with anyone, you can see not only this show, but all the previous 150 odd shows that we've completed over the years. So feel free, fill your boots, as they say. Now, again, if you're upset by media coverage of political events where journalism is junked in favour of stenography and rehashed news releases, well, you've found an alternative voice. We're here for you. Please support our crowdfunder. It's always very helpful when you do so. You know, this has been another great day for British democracy. We learned that Diane Abbott, who is a subject of a debate in the House of Commons today concerning the horrendous racist abuse that she's received. You're not going to believe this, but she was sitting there for quite some time and the speaker refused to call her. Others were able to comment not only about her, about the abuse, but about the person who abused her. They talked about the Tory party, they talked about the Labour Party. But despite all of that, the speaker refused to call her. So she never got a chance to talk about herself and how she felt. Now, this is the same speaker who tried to convince us a few weeks ago that he was imbued with a moral purpose and believed in behaving ethically. Make what you will out of that. Oh, and by the way, the Tories are keeping the money they received from her abuser. At the same time, Michael Gove has announced that he is seeking to preserve British values. Heavens. Well, we know what the British values are because we've seen them in action. And someone once said, don't believe what people say, watch what they do, watch their actions. That tells you about their ethics. Tonight we'll be talking to another excellent guest, John Brown. John is joining us tonight to talk about the Independence Forum, and amongst other things we'll be covering is how the different independence groups might cooperate and conjoin in a productive way. And he'll be taking your questions live, so there's still time to put a question. You'll see the details on the screen. Well, as you know, the TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is a show for you. We're live and we're free, so no license, no problem. Now to our guest tonight, John Brown. Thanks for joining us, John. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm very well, thank you. And I'm glad to be with you. Welcome the opportunity to have a chat.
Now, we should say right from the get-go that we expected you to be accompanied by two others from the forum, Ian Grant and Carolyn Inglis. Now, sadly, I gather that Carol is at the bedside of a dear friend who's in severe difficulty, and our thoughts are with her. And also, we have to think about Ian Grant, who's stuck with some dreadful cold or bug that he's contracted over the recent past. So our thoughts go to both of them, to Ian and Carol. And I hope you, despite your difficulties, if you can listen or watch the show, that would be terrific. And now to you, John. You're in the hot seat. You expected to be sharing with two others, and here you are, all on your lonesome.
Yeah, I'm usually a backroom boy.
Not anymore. You're front and centre. No. Why don't you kick off by telling us about the Independence Forum, what it is, how it came about, and your role in it?
Yeah, well, I've been voted the secretary of the Independence Forum, and it started off initially as an informal gathering of pro-independence groups with the intention of reuniting the movement. And following the Supreme Court judgment, we formed a formal association. So there are about 20-odd groups, both national and regional independence supporting groups. And we set a number of key objectives. Started off by commissioning experts and specialists to develop reports for a new prospectus for an independent Scotland. I wanted to identify the key issues for a vision based on the opportunities that independence provided. We also recognise that you need to look at the obstacles to independence. So we commissioned and are commissioning some reports on pensions, Scotland's place in Europe, borders, and currency in the central bank. But one of our one of our main aims is we hope to gather people together in a national convention, which will bring together civic and civil organisations democratically, in due course, democratically elected representatives, politicians, people's assemblies, and in time plan the future governance of Scotland and develop its future institutions and structures. It might even lead to a second chamber, because again, that's something that's not being discussed currently. Under devolution, we've got a single chamber legislature, but come independence, should we have a second chamber? What should its role be? So it's hoped that we'll bring a broad gathering of people together and aim initially on self-determination. And it's not something new. I mean, Scotland in the past, I mean, you're a guy for history, John, so you'll appreciate that we've had conventions in the past. We've had the Convention of the Estates in 1689, right? And the claim of right. It's still cemented into our constitutional rights. And we had the Scottish Convention, McCormack's in 1942, and we had the Convention in 1989. So this is not something new, but it's a vehicle, not a constitutional convention, but a national convention, a vehicle to get people talking about self-determination and how we can move forward.
Can we just define some of these terms then? I mean,
Sure.
most people would know, I suspect, what independence means. How does self-determination differ from independence?
Well, it encompasses the right to make decisions on your future and decisions that that help govern the country. So it will take many shapes, and it doesn't necessarily exclude independence, but because there are things now that we could address with additional powers, or actually exercising the powers that we have under devolution, and look at how we use them differently, more pragmatically, more progressively. And I think
let me just sorry to stop you there.
Sure.
But let me just offer a thought on that, if I may.
Yeah.
Because as everyone knows, part of my job here is to be devil's advocate. So let me be a bit of a devil here and advocate the following notion: that power devolved is power retained.
Yeah.
By definition. Now you're an ex-civil servant, so I don't have to tell you what that means. What it means is I'm going to give you something in the full knowledge of both parties that I can take it away anytime I wish.
Yeah.
So in that case, there is a big difference between independence and self-determination.
Yeah.
Because even though one may encompass the other to theoretically, in every sense, devolution is not a permanent answer. In fact, we've just watched the UK government grab back a bunch of powers which the Scottish government thought it had permanently.
Yeah.
In fact, thinking about the Smith Commission gave itself one primary objective, amongst others, but first and foremost it said the Scottish Parliament will be permanent, and it failed.
Yeah.
And it failed for the simple reason that you can't have two sovereign bodies. One is sovereign, everything else isn't sovereign by definition, if the language means anything. So isn't there a difficulty here with aiming for self-determination, knowing in advance that it could be taken away?
Well, it depends on whether you're doing that politically within the existing system or just trying to push the boundaries. I mean, self-determination, you're right, power devolved is power retained. But it doesn't mean that our politicians should necessarily accept it. They should be pushing the boundaries. And I see little evidence of that at this point in time, or certainly in the recent past. So I think my thinking, and I hope the thinking of people currently planning the convention is that one of the aims is, yes, we address it from a self-determination point of view and demonstrate that the power retained means that certain aspirations and priorities of the people aren't being addressed or can't be addressed unless we actually get independence. So it's a process. We start off looking at it from a self-determination point of view, and I'm confident that it will demonstrate that we do need full independence to deliver the aspirations and the expectations of the population.
So it sounds like you're comfortable with the notion that even if the politicians were to respond in the way you suggest, that they would do that in this knowledge that any concessions or any powers that they managed to secure could then be taken away.
Yes, and it gets to the point where you say independence is never given; it's got to be taken, and the circumstances need to be correct. I mean, if again, one of the drivers and the thoughts behind the Independence Forum and coming out of the planning event that we had on the 10th of February, key question is, if it happened tomorrow, right? If it was a political event or a circumstance that made independence possible, are we prepared? The short answer is no. From my perspective, and a lot of people agree with me. I mean, the Scottish government are pumping out papers, right? But is there any evidence of action and development of these papers with the electorate and the population at large and driving? Because a lot of the enthusiasm and the fire for change has to be developed. Our politicians don't seem to be doing that. They're hunting votes at the moment. Personal view?
Well, it's a reasonable view as well as personal. I think this is an election year. Mm-hmm. It'd be somewhat unrealistic not to expect politicians to be grubbing for votes. I mean, grubbing will get more intense as we head towards the election itself. But they are politicians. That's their job. You can't be a politician unless you get elected, by definition.
And what are they offering the population in exchange?
Well, that's a very good point. And you're in some respects you're preaching to the choir, because I sit here as somebody who asked the leader in Westminster several weeks ago who was responsible in the SNP for setting up the Constitutional Convention that's been promised.
Yeah.
And answer was there none. And I'm still waiting for his people to get back to me and tell me who in the SNP is responsible for this. So you're not alone. I mean, I feel massive sympathy for what you're saying. I want to take a question, if I may.
Sure.
One question is asked, ask why the Independence Forum is not openly discussing platforms like the People's Assembly, which is designed to give everyone a voice.
Well, the Independence Forum is a member organisation, and we have the People's Assembly. People's Assembly's organisation is a member, and Scotland Decides website is available with the People's Assemblies, and our aim, as I've pointed out with the convention, is to consult widely, and that will include People's Assemblies in whichever form they take. So it's not a case of we're not discussing. There's a big agenda, and I'm hoping that we have made a first step in our planning assembly with 50 odd people there on the 10th of February, taking views from across the independence movement, from all independent supporting parties and none, and different organisations. So it's a big agenda, and we've got to plan how we engage more widely with the public and the people, and there are a number of ways we can do that. People's Assemblies and electronically is one of the ways we can do it. Yes.
So the questioner is wrong then when he said the People's Assembly is offering direct democracy, resource-based, but it's not a member. It is a member, you're telling me.
The People's Assembly is. I mean, again, I don't know whether I know that People's Assembly have got at least 2 pilot community council areas in process. So you're correct in saying we're not discussing it in detail at this stage, but they're part of the organisation, and its turn will come on the agenda. we can't all speak at once, you know.
I thought that's the job for politicians. You're quite right.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be hard not to be sympathetic to your aims, John, because the fact of the matter is, when independence comes, it's not a panacea. I mean, anyone who's ever opened a history book knows that simply becoming independent does not change one heck of a lot.
Yes.
It changes the potential to change a great deal.
Yep.
But the actual act itself does not change anything unless you're prepared to use and you've prepared yourself for that change in constitutional status. Many independence movements fail because they're not prepared. So, you know, it seems to be a perfectly sensible thing that you're doing. I still have a question about the relationship between how people get together to talk about devolution at the same time as talking about independence. I mean, it seems to me these 2 things might be, in principle, opposed to each other in a particular way in certain circumstances. You know, for example, if somebody's saying we want a seat at the United Nations, then devolution is not going to deliver that.
Yep.
If somebody says, I want the Scottish Parliament to be permanent, devolution is not going to deliver that.
Yep. But again, it's taking a view from people, ordinary people, whether they come from an independence group or an action group, such as, you know, one of the Yes groups, or from, you know, some like Pensioners for India or Christians for Independence. All these people have views. Are they being listened to? The same with civic organisations. There are think tanks who are producing lots of good information, solutions to issues and problems that people have, and they're either being ignored or obstructed by the government, both governments. So it's a case of, well, we need that information, and it needs a wider audience if the politicians or the government are not listening. And the Independence Forum, with a national convention, will provide the vehicle for these views to be articulated and presented. If they're not doing it, we, organisations and people, can do it. There's a delicacy, of course, with the Independence Forum approach, because as we see at the moment, it's not the vehicle for determining the route to independence. As you say, as I've said earlier, it's preparing the way and addressing what needs to be done in the run-up to independence. Certain things can be achieved through self-determination if we push the boundaries, but it doesn't determine the route. It may provide a mass movement of people which will force politicians or new politicians to adopt a particular route that they haven't addressed at this point in time. But it's preparation and discussion.
Will you, I mean, knowing that, will you be taking a particularly active part in it? I mean, because we said earlier that the politicians across the country will be grubbing for votes soon.
Yeah.
It seems to me that puts you in a particularly advantageous position, because you can now apply pressure in a way that perhaps wasn't possible last year even, simply because all politicians will be asking people, and I can just hear the words, we want to hear from you, they'll be saying.
You might not like what they hear, of course, John.
Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, I want to hear from you, and say, well, actually, I don't want to hear from you. I want to hear from somebody else, but not you. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So it does seem to me you are in a somewhat advantageous position right now to be able to say, look, guys, we need to get something done here, and here are our views, and you need to tell us in the next short period of interval how you feel about those views.
Yep. Well, we've got time, but we don't have a date for the next general election. But our thinking from a convention planning perspective is the convention will run beyond the result of a general election, no matter what the outcome is for the individual parties. We are preparing our future. So we're planning and have to plan on the basis that a national convention in preparation for a constitutional convention and independence could run for 18 months or longer. And it will provide a range of views. But what has not been bottomed out in terms of our convention planning is what happens to those views? How do we make sure that they're acted upon? Some of the solutions are dependent on which government is in power or which political party is listened to. And they define the time and the priorities for delivering certain policies. But what we need to have in place are a range of mechanisms and state institutions that will deal with any shade of political government, and that's what's not being done at this point in time. And looking at the institutions of state and saying this needs to change to cope with the aspirations of self-determination as articulated by people in a national convention.
Okay. I mean, maybe one of the challenges you have is the one that has been outlined in previous shows. We spoke to our crofter in Tyree recently, and she's doing a fantastic job. I mean, she's on her own, running the croft on an island. But our biggest bugbear is the fact that there's no local control. Mm-hmm. Not only is there no control in Tyree, she has to travel a significant distance just to talk to somebody in Argyll. Now, this is ludicrous. You know, the Scottish government has had the powers, it seems to me, for many years to devolve power out to people who desperately need it. Yeah. And there's something ironic about a national party which wants power that isn't devolving power itself.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's somewhat bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, I'll pick you up. This is a friendly chat, John, but I don't like the term devolved in terms when you come to local government. I prefer the term decentralized. Yeah, decentralized. Fine. I mean, I can see decentralized working brilliantly for places like Orkney, Shetland, Highlands and Islands, Western Isles, borders. But we're still talking about, restructuring local authorities, and it's been on the cards for years, but nothing has actually happened. And we've actually got the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. There's that word convention again, right? I like the word convention, but I shall choose my language carefully. I don't rate COSLA, to be perfectly honest. But in an ideal world, COSLA would be changing our democratic arrangements and having decentralized government with full fiscal powers, smaller organizations with full fiscal powers delivering what the local government, the local people want, and having a centralized government. I mean, I've read a bit about the Swiss model of direct democracy. I mean, that's one way of going, but we need a Scottish model of direct democracy with decentralized government. I mean, I would reckon Shetland and Orkney would bite our hand off for a decentralized type of democracy. And it could equally work for boroughs or cities or parishes. But
what do you think? What do you think the politicians are afraid of? What do they fear will happen if they decentralize?
They'll lose power. That's what it's about. You're giving. I mean, we go on, right? I'm a member of Liberation and Salvo, right? Go on about sovereignty of the people, right? Politicians don't grasp Scottish sovereignty or sovereignty of the people, which is distinctly different from Westminster's sovereignty in Parliament. Mm-hmm. They're feared of losing power, basically. They don't trust the people to direct them and say, oh, hold on a minute, you got that wrong. You need to look at it again. Currently, we have to wait 5 years to cast our vote. And
I think I might have the temerity to suggest the difference here, and I think you've probably highlighted it earlier, so forgive me.
Sure.
There seems to be a profusion of papers. I was delighted to see the one on the Constitution, but I asked myself, so what has happened since then? And because it's one thing to say, look, this is a perfectly good way forward.
Yep.
But then you have to actually deliver, it seems to me, or at least make a token effort to deliver. So if you say, I believe in decentralization, then do it. I mean, what's the problem? I mean, you know, is a suggestion the civil service can't cope? I can't believe that's the case. So it seems to come down to the point that you made, which is it's all about, I've managed to get this little bit of power here, and there's no way that you're going to prize it out off my dead hands off this power that I fought for. Instead of saying, as you point out, look, this power has been rented to you by the people. The people will take it away unless you use it. And I think maybe that's part of the, if I may suggest that the difficulty the SNP is experiencing is that people have been years waiting for them to do something with the power. You didn't get a lot of power, people are, I suspect, thinking, but the bit you did get, you didn't fully utilize. Would that be unfair?
No, I don't think it's unfair. I'm disappointed that from one perspective, if we had more independent politicians, that is not aligned to political party, and there has always been a greater opportunity at council level to have more independence rather than party political councillors. And if you had a preponderance of consensus, independence councillors and more consensus politics at local level, then you could sell it, if selling is the right way to look at it. You could sell it as giving more power locally to local politicians rather than central politicians losing power. Now, given the performance of COSLA and the current batch of councils, that's not going to happen tomorrow, is it?
But in reality, the Scottish Parliament was set up so that it required wheeling and dealing in order to govern. I mean, we did have that very extraordinary situation where the SNP had a working majority, but that wasn't the way it was designed. So, strictly speaking, at least in theory, the Scottish government the Scottish Parliament should have embodied the very notions that you just said. At least in theory, but parties would have to cooperate in order to govern.
But again, because the Parliament was set up allegedly with that in mind, if you look at the standing orders for Holyrood, right, they came about by an act, part of the Scotland Act. Westminster set some of the standing orders. I believe they now have more power within Holyrood to change the standing orders so that they could actually have more proactive, I was going to say interference, but more proactive engagement by the public on petitions and referenda. But the rules are set in such a way that the power is retained by the politicians. You can't interfere with any legislative process except through the committee system. You can't bring about a petition that will be rejected if it addresses something that's currently working its way through Parliament in Holyrood or is less than 12 months old. Now, that's not democracy. That is power being retained by the members of the legislature at the expense of the public. That could be changed, I think, if there was a will within Parliament under devolution as part of self-determination, so that within bounds they could take on initiatives generated by pressure groups and the public on key issues. and actually hold a referendum on controversial legislation. I'll give you an example. The juryless trials, I've forgotten what the title of the bill going through Parliament is. The Liberation Salvo put in comments on that bill to the committee, and we put in there that the bill, when it's presented to the House at the second or third stage, should have the line subject to a referendum, because it would be possible to hold a referendum on a piece of legislation going through Parliament if it was built into the bill. But that won't be done, because that gives the power to the people to decide on a piece of controversial legislation, which the government are determined to put through.
Is that because it was in the manifesto?
I can't remember anybody. I can't remember seeing that particular. It may have been a phrase or a line, or I doubt if it was a paragraph.
Yeah.
In the manifesto, and that's a problem with manifestos, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a problem. I mean, well, we're in a situation here right now across the UK where there's a whole bunch of things being done that weren't in manifestos.
Yep.
In fact, the intended and most likely next government, the Labour government, has actually said in more or less these terms, which is that in order to get elected, we're going to say one thing, but trust us, once we get into power, we'll do something completely different.
Yep.
You think, well, what nonsense is this? It's an insult to democracy, even to suggest such a thing. Be honest with people, for crying out loud. If the public wants anything from its politicians right now, it's integrity and honesty. And here we've got an opposition, the main opposition party in the UK, saying we intend to be duplicitous. It's so crazy. It doesn't even beg consideration, really. I mean, it's outrageous.
Yep.
But that seems to be the way the system is set up. It encourages people to behave badly. There's no reward for behaving well, but there are many, many rewards for behaving badly.
So I'd like to think that a national convention, before we get to writing or putting down in words our constitution for an independent Scotland, they would have standing committees of experts, knowledgeable people in terms of parliamentary process and what you would expect of politicians and the legislature and the executive, and thrashing out in discussion over a period of time what the new rules should be for the democratic process, not set by politicians, set by ordinary people. You don't, I read a funny on Twitter this week. I'm a guardian of chickens, and I've recruited a fox to look after my chicken coop, but my attitude to chickens hasn't changed. Something along those lines. I mean, you don't get a politician to write their own rules.
But you do. You talked about the National Convention, which might lead to a constitutional convention, which would shape a constitution for independent Scotland. But the reality is, the Scottish government's already released its constitution paper with an interim constitution. So that ship has sailed. That bus is gone.
Well, if you accept that an interim constitution is the responsibility of a government, I don't.
No matter who's going to write it then?
Well, it needs to be written, right? It doesn't need to be written by a politician. There are plenty of people who can write. What you need...
But the version they have wasn't written by a politician. It was approved by a politician. It was written by Elliot Bulmer.
Yep, I've seen part of it, yeah.
So why would you want to redraft something that's been written by an expert?
Well, there are clauses and explanations possibly in a draft interim constitution that hasn't been tested against popular will or popular view. At the end of the day, a constitution, the final constitution, has to be voted for and accepted in a referendum by the people. So why should an interim constitution be any different, given that we're nowhere near independence, and there is time in convention, not a constitutional convention, in convention to look at constitution an interim draft constitution based on the aspirations and the needs of the people, not on the aspirations and needs of groups of individuals selected by the party of government.
It's interesting. I like the notion. The way these things generally work, again, quoting from history, is that a new nation state would begin with an interim constitution, because somebody has to write something. Otherwise, you end up a bit like the UK, which has a constitution which is less valid than your local tennis or golf club. In terms of its robustness. So you generally start off with an interim constitution which takes you through to independence. You need that because you have to reassure people whose support you might need in the greater world that you're not some bunch of raving lunatics who've taken over government in Scotland. You need to provide a piece of paper that says this is our contract with the Scottish people. It's interim until the Scottish people elect their own independent entity, and it will then be reviewed by the people themselves, and it will have to be put to the people in a referendum, because you cannot, in all conscience, have a constitution that doesn't have popular support and approval. But you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I recall having a discussion with Elliot, and I think we still disagree, and that my view on an interim constitution is that it can't be a safe pair of hands, business as usual, given that we're moving away from something which is business as usual and is anathema to the Scottish population, that is Westminster. So it can't be business as usual. It needs to address, the same as any government, any interim constitution, in the first 100 days, if you don't achieve certain things, you're never going to achieve it. So an interim constitution has to have significant popular change within it.
Well, the differences, let me suggest to you some significant differences between any interim constitution for Scotland and that which pertains at present from Westminster. First of all, it would embody the sovereignty of the people, i.e. that it would not be an institution, it would be sovereign, as Westminster is, but it would be the people. Now, as soon as you embody that simple fact, you change everything, because it cannot be business as usual by definition, because you've taken sovereignty away from an institution and given it to the people. That's a very different proposition, I would suggest to you.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And so therefore it could not possibly be business as usual. Because Westminster regards sovereignty of the people pretty much as an anathema. I mean, the sovereignty of the people only exists during one general election period. Once that's over and done with, sovereignty goes back to Westminster again.
But you take the point that we do have time, I suggest,
I agree.
To make an interim constitution more in line with popular expectation of popular sovereignty, rather than an expert advice to a government in power.
Accepting sovereignty to the people would be a huge change for this island, because it just doesn't pertain anywhere else. It would be revolutionary in that sense, because while it may contain overtones of draft constitutional type documents of the past, this would be the first time it would actually be embodied in print. And it would require the politicians to see themselves as servants of the people rather than masters. Because unfortunately, the Westminster system encourages the opposite. It encourages people with some sort of power complex to climb the greasy pole to become Prime Minister. Because as soon as you do that at Westminster, effectively, if you've got a working majority, you can do whatever the hell you like. Which in a democracy is not a healthy thing, I would suggest. Have you been watching the situation in the United States, where it looks like the two candidates being advanced are Trump and Biden? What's your take on that?
Well, I'm just glad I'm not an American, to be honest. It's Hobson's choice, and I do not wish. I have American friends and colleagues, so I don't want to be But it's a, it's a broken. To me, it's a broken system. And I don't know how to get out of it. And it gets to. I make the comparison. It's money that's driving it. That to me is the nature of the beast and the problem. And I think we have an opportunity in Scotland to come up with something different where money doesn't drive it. I mean, the discussion today about £10 million going to a political party, I mean, that just is obscene from my perspective. And I expect a lot of people in Scotland to have the same view. And that, I think, is the nub of the problem. Within the US, politics is driven by big bucks, billionaires, and power. And it's a manipulation of politicians. We've got that at Westminster to a degree as well. We don't have it to the same extent that I can discern in Holyrood. I may be wrong, but we have an opportunity to start afresh. I don't know what the solution is and how you do it, but there are plenty of people out there who could form a view and form the rules where mega bucks doesn't corrupt the democratic process.
Well, the easiest way to do that is to curb the power of lobbyists.
Yep.
And the way you do that is by making the process transparent. And now, as you say, anytime a lobbyist meets with a minister, I, being the sovereign here, require to know what that conversation was and what its intentions are. And I want to know who the lobbyist is, and I want to know who the minister is. So in other words, you use a bright light to sanitize the process.
Again, it depends how you go about doing that, John. Of course, I mean, if we were going down a Convention of Estates second chamber with ordinary people rotating in and rotating out, some have suggested a jury-type service, and that would be one means of controlling the lobbying system, because at the moment it's self-monitoring and self-governing, and if anyone's found to have broken the rules or have fallen short on lobbying, then they self-regulate and self-impose, the punishment. It needs to be Joe Public or someone separate. So why couldn't it be possibly a Convention of the Estate second chamber with ordinary people doing jury service?
I can suggest to you one thought that will occur to some people, which is that, hold on a second here. These guys claim that they want to get rid of Westminster and all of its opaqueness and all of its sort of hankering back to a lost empire, and its two chambers, a whole bunch of characters sitting in the House of Lords, pontificating, bloviating, and worse still, making laws. I thought we wanted to get rid of all that. And now what you're suggesting is that there should be some sort of Scottish equivalent of the House of Lords. That's what people might think.
They might think I didn't say that. I said a jury service. A jury isn't sitting there forever like the House of Lords. House of Lords you can't get rid of. You can't get rid of them. A jury serve a limited term that could be determined, and it's a process. It's not House of Lords, but that again needs to be discussed. We're not having that debate. Is anybody having that debate in Scotland at the moment? No. I suggest a national convention could start to address these sorts of issues and come to conclusions or recommendations at the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, I would agree with you, by the way. I was just playing silly songs there. But I
knew what you're doing.
No, seriously. I mean, I can see the whole point of a revising chamber. I can see the point of ordinary folks saying, hold on a second. This makes no sense to me, because they've not been influenced by lobbyists. Their position is the man in the street, the woman in the street. So it seems to be perfectly healthy. I think there would be some pushback if people thought it was anything like the House of Lords. That was the point I was making. Derek Kerr is saying that he's got a view on the claim of right. What's your view of the claim of right?
Well, my view is that it forms part of Scotland's constitution. It's still on the statute book. It still gives us lessons on how Scottish society operated and can operate with the best of principles. I won't go overboard on it. It's not a panacea. It's not the solution to independence. It's the solution and guidance to how society could best operate. But it needs underpinning with a lot more information to make it a workable modern constitution. And I think the people in Salvo are doing a brilliant job. I would say that anyway, wouldn't I? But there's no doubt the dialogue and discussion has changed considerably since Salvo came on the scene. Well, people weren't talking about sovereignty in the same way, or the claim of right at all, before Salvo came along. It was a laughingstock if it was brought up to many, and it's being taken seriously. It needs to be taken in context, and it has a fundamental role to play in establishing what I would call Scottish society in an independent Scotland, with an eye backward. You learn from the past to influence the future. Tagline for Salvo, but it's you build on it in modern terms.
Well, they do say if you don't learn from the past, you're condemned to relive it.
Absolutely, yeah,
And,
absolutely.
I mean, all of these things are worthwhile. I think when you go into the wider world, you need something hugely robust, because you need to explain the contract between the new state and its citizens.
Yep.
And you need to phrase that in terms that the world will understand and appreciate and support. In other words, it's not just a contract between the state and its citizens, it's also a contract with the wider world. It has to embody what the state stands for and what it will not stand for. And the difficulty with the UK just now is that there isn't a single soul, and I suspect this includes everyone in the present government and the main opposition, who have the slightest clue what they stand for and what they will not stand for. And I think the situation in the Middle East has underscored that. If anything, it's amplified that. And it seems to me whatever is done in Scotland needs to avoid these traps and be clear to people and to be specific. So I applaud all the efforts that have been taken to make it more evident what sovereignty is and more particularly what it isn't. Because right now, nobody in Scotland, as far as the UK government is concerned, is sovereign.
Yeah, and it's built into the psyche of the people of Scotland. I mean, there are so many things that we do that are fundamentally based on our own sovereignty. Jock Thompson's bairns, it just falls off. Everybody's equal. That is just anathema to the Westminster view of people are subject. That is the fundamental difference.
Well, you said that, but we're about to be exposed to an election campaign. And you'll be told time and time again that the Labour Party stands for the working man and woman. And they embody all of that stuff about Jock Thompson's bairns, and that people who previously flirted with independence should junk it and head for the Labour Party and vote for it. And if that argument fails, this is the argument that we put to people. Do you want the Tories back in again? If you don't, then you have to vote Labour, because that's the only. Whereas the real answer is that, frankly, it doesn't make much difference to Scotland which of those two is elected, because things will continue just as they did before. I mean, there's no evidence that anything will be any different. I mean, because, having lived in the South for a long period of time, nobody really thinks about what Scotland wants or needs. And frankly, why should they? What do they care? I mean, it's not as if people don't care. It's just that they don't think about it. A lot of people in Scotland think, oh, there's a whole bunch of people south of the border who are bitterly opposed. No, they're not. They don't care. They're apathetic.
Well, I think we really should care, because come independence and our territorial rights and our resources are managed for the benefit of the people of Scotland, and it will have an impact on the people down south who are comfortably well off, power-wise. I mean, they're not paying through the nose the same way as somebody in Wick or Aberdeen for their power, their electricity. That's a change.
I would take issue with that. Speaking bluntly, there are millions of people south of the border who are strapped for cash, who cannot feed their families, they cannot heat their homes. If you're talking about the southeast, then you're dealing with a very different entity. But the UK is run primarily for the benefit of the people in the southeast, and I sometimes become concerned when I hear people phrase it in terms of England versus Scotland, because it isn't really. It's centralisation, really.
But the more the English population understand the situation in Scotland, the better informed they are and the better placed they are to exercise their influence and power over Westminster. I was going to use sweary words, but I won't. I mean,
we're all grown up here. You can use sweary words.
That's what behind me saying the people of Scotland should be the people of England should be concerned, because it will impact on them, yes. And they need to know about it in advance so that they can force their government to do something about it and come to terms with Scotland.
Hold on a second here. With the greatest respect, how can they force their government? We just talked about politicians who don't listen. And we talked about the institution being sovereign, not the people. So how can these poor folks in England exercise that power that you imagine they have?
Yeah, well, that's up to them to decide. But if they're working class and socialists and followers of the Labour Party myth, then they'll do something about it and they'll gang up, right?
Really?
I'm talking tongue in cheek, John.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. But again, people need to waken up. How they deal with their politicians, it could be the same way that Scotland deals with the politicians.
I think it would need a constitutional change in England to bring that about, I would suggest to you, because right now, I suspect the English voter is even more remote from government than his or her Scottish counterpart.
Yeah. And I mean, they've been there before. They didn't want to elect. What was it? A few years ago, they had the opportunity to. The regions of England had opportunities to. It wasn't constitutional. Almost being like self-governing areas, and they didn't go down that road. I forgot what it's.
Yeah, it was a sort of parliament for the north.
Yes,
but it stemmed from an internal discussion in the Labour Party, and was presented in such a cack-handed way by cack-handed individuals. It's hardly surprising that people voted to oppose it, because for them it just looked like another layer of politicians, and they figured the present lot weren't up to much good. Why should they vote for more? Which, interesting, is the same argument that was used to oppose devolution in Scotland. It was about an expensive tier of government that you didn't need. But the difficulty with that argument is that Scots decided that the bit they didn't want was Westminster. Which is always the devil's in the detail with these things,
Yeah.
So, the Independence Forum, you're up and working. You're hoping to have a national convention starting soon, which will extend right over the period of the next election.
Yep.
Which means you'll be reporting next year.
Yep. Well, that's the sort of thing that we need to still work out. I mean, a convention could be a rolling convention. In other words, it doesn't just produce one product, one report. Again, that's to be decided. I mean, we've got 20-odd organisations at the moment with a large membership, and we're preparing and planning. Our website, independenceforum.scot, has got pages about us and who can join the Independence Forum and help us set up the National Convention. We haven't got individual membership at this stage. It's group organisation, but we will work towards that individual membership as we plan setting up the convention.
Okay.
But we're looking to expand involvement into civic and civil organisations. So we'll be making approaches in the coming weeks and months to organisations to consult and take their view, their priorities. And one of the things that current member organisations are quite clear on, that a national convention has to have experts there, but they've got to be on tap, not on top making decisions, right?
Man, that sounds like a civil servant speaking now.
It's not civil servant speak. That is coming out of a planning event with real people, right? The same with, I pointed out earlier, John, that the National Convention will have elected politicians, elected representatives in the convention. But to start out with, the people planning it, the forum members, are quite clear that politicians are not invited at this point in time to make decisions. Yes, they could come along and listen and take part, but again, it's a process of informing politicians, not taking their views on board at this stage. So further down the line, perhaps after the general election or whatever, and the convention is up and running and has its aims, objectives, and modus operandi in place, then at that point, it could be that politicians and ordinary people, ordinary members of the convention, are making decisions together on a rolling basis. That's still to be worked out.
Yeah, I mean, it seems laudable. I mean, there's no question it sounds laudable. I wish you all the best in your dealings with politicians. As I do to everyone who comes on this program, including politicians, by the way.
A civil servant for 40 years. Say no more.
Well, as they say, you paid your dues then, that's for sure, if you're an operational civil servant. But you worked in the Cabinet Office too, didn't you?
For a short period, yes. I think a lot of people don't realise that the Cabinet Office, a lot of people work there are on secondment. So I was actually on secondment from my home department for a few years.
Our thoughts were with you. By the way, before we close, and we've only got a couple of minutes left, let me just repeat our good wishes to Carol and Ian. And wish them all the very best. And perhaps at some later stage, if they feel they would like to come on the show, then there's an open invitation to them to do so. Because I know that both Ian and Carol would probably have been welcomed the opportunity to share the platform with you. So our best wishes to both of them. Just in closing, if you've got one small comment you would like to make before we finish, John, what would it be?
Dear. Well, consensus politics and talking about differences is a good thing and will help move us forward. If we do it in a convention, I can see a promising future ahead.
Excellent.
Lot to be done.
Excellent. Summed up in a sentence. Well done. Well done. Thanks again, Ian. I'm just going to say a few concluding remarks. If you can stick around for a few seconds, that would be very good. Thank you again. Well, there we are, folks. Our time is up. Thanks to you for joining us. And a big thank you to John, who put up with all my sort of rather odd questions throughout the show. As always, we have a formidable list of guests lined up. Look out for the show next week, which features Sarah Douglas and Caroline from Reunite Families. And they are perhaps some of the many victims of the mess that Brexit has created. It has separated families in the most atrocious way. I mean, you think the government has mismanaged Brexit. Wait till you hear some of the details from Reunite Families. So come and join us for next week's show. And to all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe. Take care. Good night, all.